Hey everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Amelia Linn, and I am the Director of Global Policy at Mercy for Animals. And we're so excited to be launching our report today in partnership with the Global Law Alliance for Animals and the Environment. So today's webinar is on the Ramsar Convention and animal agriculture. And if you're not familiar with the Ramsar Convention, we should be learning a lot about it today. But as a very brief overview, the Ramsar Convention is the primary international policy instrument for the conservation of wetland ecosystems and allows countries to designate certain wetlands as areas of international importance. More than half of these designated wetlands around the world are reported to be negatively impacted by agricultural activities. And if you're not already familiar with Ramsar, I encourage you to take a look at this map, and I'll put it in the chat now, of Ramsar sites around the world. So you can see what sites are closest to where you live. I'm usually based in New York City, but right now I'm visiting family in Florida, and I am close to the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge, which is a designated Ramsar site and the second largest wetland complex in the United States. So I encourage you to take a look and see what sites are near you. And Phoebe, if we could go to the next slide, please. Before we get started, I just wanted to note that today's session is being recorded and we'll make it available after the webinar to share with colleagues that weren't able to attend live. And throughout the webinar, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll save the last 10 minutes or so of the webinar to answer audience questions. And if you have any technical difficulties, please reach out to us in the chat box and we will try our best to help. So in just a moment, I'll share a little bit more about our collaboration and the report that we're launching today. And then I'll give a very brief introduction to the ways that animal agriculture is impacting wetland ecosystems. And then we'll hear from Professor Erica Lyman more on the Ramsar Convention. And finally, we'll hear from my colleague Carmen on updates from the SOS Yucatan campaign in Mexico. And then we'll take the last few minutes of the webinar to go through questions. So before we get started, I wanted to introduce the report for today. Phoebe, if you could go to the next slide. So we are so excited to launch this new report on the Ramsar Convention and animal agriculture. The report is available in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, and we'll add these links to all three versions in the chat. This report was a collaboration between the Global Law Alliance for Animals and the Environment and Mercy for Animals. The Global Law Alliance at Lewis and Clark Law School is a champion for wild animals and wild spaces across the globe, working to protect animals and the environment through the development, implementation, and enforcement of international law. Law students actively participate in the Global Law Alliance's work for academic credit. And Mercy for Animals is an international nonprofit organization working to end industrial animal agriculture by constructing a just and sustainable food system. Mercy for Animals operates in Brazil, Canada, India, Mexico, and the United States, and uses legal advocacy, corporate campaigns, investigations, and public engagement to bring about meaningful change for animals. Through this report, we aim to explore potential pathways under the Ramsar Convention that could support efforts to address impacts of animal agriculture on wetlands. We really hope that this report will serve as a resource for environment and animal advocates around the world as they pursue novel policy avenues to end the environmental destruction caused by animal agriculture. And we very much encourage you to share these reports with colleagues and organizations that you think might be interested in exploring this advocacy pathway. So if you'll give me just a moment, I'm going to add the links to the report in the chat. And I encourage you to take a look. All right. And then before we move on, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our two panelists for today. So we'll first hear from Erica Lyman, who is a clinical professor of law at Lewis and Clark Law School and the director of the Global Law Alliance for Animals and the Environment. Professor Lyman is based in Portland, Oregon, and has over 15 years of experience practicing and teaching international environmental law with a strong focus on wildlife protection issues. And our second panelist is my colleague, Carmen Quintana, the Director of Communications for Mercy for Animals, Latin America. Carmen is based in Mexico City and has more than 10 years of experience in communications in various areas. She's been concerned about animals for almost the same amount of time and believes that a fairer world is possible. Phoebe, could you go to the next slide? Thank you. Before we get started, I'm going to give just a very brief overview of the kinds of impacts that animal agriculture has on wetland ecosystems. Next slide. So first, we know that wetlands are vital ecosystems that provide sources of fresh water and serve as home to rich biological diversity. They provide ecosystem services that sustain the health of the broader environment. However, agriculture and animal agriculture in particular are threatening these critical ecosystems. Overall, Ramsar reports have found that over half of the designated Ramsar sites around the world are negatively affected by agriculture, and that livestock farming directly impacts 25% of all Ramsar sites. These impacts can vary and have different causes. So one of those is that crop and grazing lands now cover nearly half of the Earth's surface. This land conversion in part has led to a 35% decline in natural wetlands since 1970. Wetlands also suffer from the disposal or leakage of waste from animal agriculture, which largely goes untreated. This waste contains nutrients, ammonia, phosphorus, antibiotics, hormones, and bacteria, and leads to overnutrification and risks to human health and biodiversity. For humans, exposure to animal agriculture's contaminants through both water ingestion and other means of water contact can lead to multiple health risks, including nitrate poisoning. In addition, large amounts of synthetic fertilizers are used for cereal production, and almost 40% of the global cereal production is then used to feed livestock. Cereals account for almost 60% of global usage of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. And when these fertilizers enter wetland ecosystems, they result in eutrophication, increases in productivity for invasive species, and declines in native species, and higher rates of nutrient leaching, all of which can have significant broader ecological consequences. And finally, in the report, we did a case study on mangrove ecosystems in particular. And mangroves, of course, provide habitat for aquatic plant life, marine mammals, and numerous fish species. They also have a really high capacity for carbon sequestration and can be natural elements for coastal resilience and climate adaptation. However, because mangroves exist in coastal areas, they're vulnerable to upstream pesticide, fertilizer, and animal waste. And at least 307 Ramsar sites are mangroves, and of these, 164 are affected by agriculture and aquaculture, according to Ramsar's database. So this is just one example of the type of wetland ecosystem that's already facing these impacts from animal agriculture. And with that brief overview, I'm going to hand it over to Erica to talk more about the Ramsar Convention and the mechanisms that we looked at in this report.
So next slide, please. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Amelia, and thank you to the Mercy for Animals team for inviting me to present our research on the Ramsar Convention. What I'm going to do with this presentation is just introduce some of the basic core elements of the treaty, which represent the fundamental obligations of countries that decide to join the treaty, and then discuss some of the treaty-based options that exist to remedy concerns about deteriorating wetland conditions, or that advocates might use to draw attention to concerning damage to wetlands, frankly, either the result of animal agriculture or otherwise, if there are diverse interests represented in our audience. What I'm going to present today is a very high-level overview. I do want to just mention that there is a lot more content and a lot more description and background and context in the handbook. So please do save those links so that you can cross-reference any material or get more information. Amelia introduced the basic concept of a wetland, animal agriculture impacts on wetlands, and highlighted some of the types of sites that are listed as Ramsar sites and might be impacted by agriculture. And so the question for us then is, what can we do about it? When a particular site or a particular wetland is listed as a wetland of international importance under the Ramsar Convention, certain treaty-based tools may be helpful from advocacy campaign and change-making perspectives. But first, we need to take just a little bit of time to think about the background of the treaty and just make sure we're all on the same page. So the Convention on Wetlands of International Importance, especially as waterfowl habitat, is the official name of the treaty. And convention, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is essentially a synonym for treaty. This particular treaty was signed and adopted in Ramsar, Iran in 1971. And that's why in shorthand, it's known as the Ramsar Convention. So these are the same treaties. And it officially became international law in 1975. So it's one of our really early generation international environmental treaties. You might note from the title of the treaty that it is referencing wetlands that especially protect waterfowl habitat. So it really did have this like early emphasis on waterbird protections. It's still a core element of this particular treaty and the work of the countries, but as you'll see, the definitions are very broad, the work is broad, and the interests of the parties and the treaty infrastructure is broad. So not at all limited just to waterfowl conservation. Next slide, please. So the treaty itself is based on a recognition of the ecological importance of wetlands to both biological diversity and human well-being and development. We see that in the preamble, which recognizes a multitude of benefits that derive from wetlands, including economic, cultural, scientific, and recreational values. So as a baseline, it really is a multiple use treaty. And I think that's important to recognize. In recognition of that sort of multiple use baseline and recognizing the values as articulated in the preamble, the treaty's goal is really to prevent wetland encroachment and degradation. And in order to realize this goal, the countries that are party to the treaty have identified 3 pillars to represent this work. And that's a term of art that they use. So these are the 3 pillars of the treaty. The first is designating sites as wetlands of international importance. We've talked a little bit about that, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. Cooperating internationally on transboundary and shared wetland spaces, as well as shared species. And then third, the wise use of all wetlands. And this is where we really see recognition of the multiple use aspects of wetland conservation according to the Ramsar Convention. And we'll come back to the concept of wise use, but let's first look at how sites are designated. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Amelia already shared this link and this map. Here's a little representation of what you see when you click on this link. There's 2,400 wetlands already listed as Ramsar sites. So it's really an expansive geographical treaty. There's 172 countries that are party to the treaty. And in sort of, geographical space represented by these wetlands, it's actually really quite significant. Every country that joins the treaty has to designate at least 1 site when they become a member of the treaty, and then most have designated many more. The kinds of sites that qualify for listing are those that are representative of rare or unique wetland types, that are important for conservation of biodiversity other than water birds, or that are important for waterbird conservation. So these are really general criteria, lots and lots and lots of different kinds of wetlands can be listed as these sites of international importance. So just in case you haven't, as participants, clicked on this link in the chat, I just want to highlight what an amazing tool this database really is. You can look up wetlands, Ramsar wetlands by country, by factors that are negatively affecting the site, by different sort of geographic characteristics of particular sites. So you can really dig in and see what's around you, like Amelia did, noting that she is currently near the Okefenokee wetland. I forget the US designation of it, sorry. You know, and I do want to say, like, in fact, you can even search for a list of all the wetlands in your country that are designated or have been highlighted as impacted by agriculture, and then filter even more specifically to see sites that are impacted by animal agriculture. So next slide, please. So listing sites on the Ramsar list of wetlands of international importance is what essentially triggers the obligations for the countries that host those sites. The convention requires that countries adhere to wise use principles in order to avoid ecological changes to the ecological character of wetlands. So it's these two sort of fundamental concepts that we're looking at as a baseline for management and conservation of wetland resources. One, that you're engaging in wise use, and that wise use should be avoiding changes to the ecological character of a particular wetland. The ecological character of a wetland, according to the Ramsar Convention, is the preservation of the ecosystems and benefits and services that characterize a wetland at the time of listing. So there is a baseline sort of time-bound aspect to the scope of ecological character. And ultimately, it's the human-induced adverse alterations of any ecosystem component, process, or ecosystem benefit or service that we're looking at to assess whether changes have occurred. So next slide, please. Thank you. When we do have changes to ecological character, the information needs to be made available to the Secretariat. So this is a built-in obligation of the treaty under Article 3.2, which says that parties have an obligation to report adverse changes in ecological character to the Secretariat anytime that this happens or they become aware of it happening, as well as in annual reports that are due to the Secretariat. So even though the obligation exists for the countries that have signed up and indicated their agreement to the Ramsar Convention being law, the Ramsar Secretariat is open to hearing from any third-party stakeholders that there are adverse ecological changes occurring at Ramsar-listed wetlands. So this is a really important piece of our advocacy puzzle, and that is just the treaty's space and willingness to be open to receive information from anyone who has relevant information. It's not unique amongst international environmental treaties, but I do think from my review of this treaty and analysis and what I know, that there is a rare, if not unique, openness and willingness to receive information to the Ramsar Secretariat. And the ability to share that information, as Carmen is going to describe, really has the potential to support advocacy campaigns. So once the Secretariat receives information about adverse ecological changes, it opens what it calls an Article 3.2 case. And that is what triggers a dialogue between the relevant country and the Ramsar Secretariat. So once that dialogue is in place, then a number of things can happen. It is international law, so talking could continue ad nauseum, but the treaty and the parties to the treaty have taken steps to create facilitative mechanisms, two in particular that are the most likely outcomes of an Article 3.2 case. And those are either a Ramsar advisory mission. You can go to the next slide, please, Phoebe. Or what's called a listing on the Montreux record. So it's important to note that these are facilitative mechanisms. They're not compliance mechanisms in maybe the strict traditional sense that we think of compliance mechanisms. They're not going to force behavior change, but they can lead to behavior change, and they can be really important tools, not just for increasing awareness about change, but for studying the adverse impacts, as we're going to see, and really getting to a place where concrete recommendations are made to ameliorate the adverse changes that are occurring. Next slide, please. I've thrown a lot of international environmental lingo at you, so I thought it might be helpful just to take a quick minute before we get into the substance of the facilitative mechanisms, just to all get on the same page about how treaties work. And that's because a treaty exists far beyond the actual paper legal document that constitutes the law, if you will. Most of these treaty spaces comprise multiple entities that support the ongoing policy work of each convention. As you are interested in the Ramsar Convention, the entities that you're going to want to take note of are listed here in this slide. One of the most important is the Secretariat. I've mentioned the Secretariat a couple times. It's an administrative body that exists permanently, so it has permanent staff, and that staff is tasked with functioning as a clearinghouse, organizing meetings, receiving information, sharing information out to the parties being officially called contracting parties, but being the countries that have accepted the Ramsar Convention as law. So they are sort of the main functioning body of the Ramsar Convention at all times. And then there are these other entities that come together at certain moments in time to have meetings like you see in this picture. This is a room I'm all too familiar with at the CICG Center in Geneva. This is a Ramsar Convention meeting. Sorry, I just got a call on my computer. The meeting that you see here is what's called a conference of the parties. So this is a meeting of all of the countries that are party to the treaty where policy decisions are taken. And then each country that is a member of the treaty designates an administrative authority, which is typically an agency in the executive branch of the government, and then specifically individuals who are national focal points. And they are likely the people who you see here in this picture. The other important entities are the Scientific and Technical Review Panel and the Standing Committee. The STRP is particularly important for implementation of these facilitative mechanisms, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so it's a little bit of a pivot, but I think it's important for everybody to get the language and the sort of background context. If we could go to the next slide, we can move back into how these facilitative mechanisms work. So a Ramsar advisory mission, or a RAM, is probably the most, of the two, the most functional, real mechanism-like mechanism, in that it results in concrete steps taken by the Secretariat, by the party that is hosting the relevant site, and then in addition, third-party experts. So a RAM, for short, the Ramsar Advisory Mission, involves a visit to a Ramsar wetland by a team of policy and scientific experts that are hired by the Secretariat. So these third-party experts that are hired for their very specific expertise, given whatever the adverse ecological changes or information as presented to the Secretariat. They're tasked with providing the best available technical advice, so that can be scientific, governance, social, all sorts of different kinds of experts can be hired. That team will usually comprise 3 experts. The visit typically takes anywhere from 1 to 10 days, so they can be very involved visits, where the team meets with various stakeholders, assesses issues raised in the RAM letter or application. The team is observing and evaluating the overall health of the wetland, and then considering options that would aid in returning the site to its ecological character at the time of listing. So when the mission ends, the team produces a report that summarizes the current state of the site, and then I think most importantly, provides these concrete recommendations. And that report is made available on the convention website. So it's available to the public. It really does create, if not behavior change explicitly, definitely the potential for some accountability, which I think is a really useful tool. If we could go to the next slide, Phoebe. This just kind of gives a little bit of an overview of the types of recommendations that have been made. One of the greatest opportunities is really the ability to be responsive to the fact-finding of the mission by the experts. And so the experts have recommended in all of the RAM reports that we've reviewed, everything from governance transitions and new governance structures, so recommending task forces, inclusion of a variety of stakeholders who might have been ostracized from decision-making in the past, education and awareness building, environmental impact and evaluation processes, which can be really critical. Excuse me. Recommendations have also gone so far as to recommend specific legal reforms and even enforcement that should be taking place probably when there is illegal conduct or behavior. And I think something like that might be relevant as we hear from Carmen potentially. And then in some cases, like these mission experts are even recommending that certain activities cease. And we in fact saw that in our review of Ramsar advisory mission reports, where in at least one case, the team of experts recommended that a proposed dairy farm project be reevaluated and potentially aborted entirely. So I think that the recommendation potential that comes out of these missions can be really, really helpful tool. If you go to the next slide, please, Phoebe. In at least one notable case, and I don't want to go into detail, the details are in the handbook, because I don't want to take time away from Carmen, but there has been at least one situation that we know of where a RAM coupled with really strong local advocacy efforts in Mexico caused local officials to withdraw permits for the construction of a huge resort complex. that would have negatively impacted a marine wetland and coral reef. So you can definitely see the potential of these recommendations to really be implemented for the better in certain countries. And of course, the country has to be responsive to the recommendations, right? And that's creating the culture of sort of that responsiveness is a lot of what the campaign work is. So the second facilitative mechanism that exists under the Ramsar Convention is what's called the Montreux Record. The Montreux Record is a list of Ramsar sites that have been identified as suffering adverse ecological changes and that have been required as priority, as have been identified, sorry, as requiring priority attention, either by the host country, potentially by other countries, or by third-party stakeholders. So again, this is a dialogue about a Montreux listing can be begun by third-party stakeholders and advocates like many of you. So what happens in this case is obviously, you know, it's an Article 3.2 case, just like we saw before. And this is where the dialogue results in the scientific review and, the scientific and technical review panel supporting a listing of the site on the Montreux Record or recommending it as a useful potential tool. And then the party agreeing that the site should go on the Montreux Record. Now, the interesting thing here is that it does elevate awareness of the challenges that that particular site is facing, but in and of itself, it doesn't necessarily do anything else, right? So, of course, a party then is supposed to prioritize attention to it and describe in updates in their annual reports and their other reporting obligations what they're doing to address the adverse changes in ecological character, but it doesn't functionally lead to much else, except that sites that are proposed for listing on the Montreux Record can, or maybe better said, a recommendation to propose a site on the Montreux Record can lead to a RAM for that particular site. So there is some synergy between these two processes. Next slide. Oh, next slide. I might have forgotten to say next slide. Apologies about that. So I just quickly in conclusion, and hopefully I haven't taken too much time, I'm happy to answer questions. But I just want to, you know, sort of summarize that any NGO or advocate that wishes to draw attention to a particular wetland that is a Ramsar listed wetland can leverage the Ramsar advisory mission process or the Montreux Record process as catalysts for action. And I think this is particularly true where there has been advocacy that has maybe faced, you know, government deadlock or stagnation at a national level. Because these third-party experts come in, there is really potential, I think, to unlock some maybe recalcitrance or reluctance at the national government level to deal with issues. So from there, I'm going to pass it along to Carmen, who's going to talk about a specific campaign that Mercy for Animals is running.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you, Amelia, for the introduction. So my name is Carmen, and I'm going to talk to you about our campaign to spread this message about the mega farms in Yucatan. Phoebe, next slide, please. And the next one, please. So first, we're gonna watch the video for our campaign, and it's gonna last about 2 minutes. So I'm just gonna let you watch it.
La selva maya está en peligro. La gran cantidad de granjas porcícolas instaladas en Yucatán está provocando una serie de problemas ecológicos y sociales que afectan tanto la biodiversidad de la zona como quienes habitan esta región. En marzo de 2023, la Semarnat presentó un dictamen de la actividad porcícola en Yucatán en el que contabilizó 507 posibles granjas de cerdo. Estas fueron localizadas con una metodología de visualización geoespacial por medio de las herramientas Google Maps y QGIS. Sin embargo, en una investigación de Mercy for Animals Latinoamérica, en la que se utilizó el mismo método de geolocalización, detectamos omisiones en dicho dictamen. Nuestro estudio tuvo como objetivo inicial comprobar que efectivamente existían cada una de las granjas reconocidas por la Semarnat. No obstante, identificamos que esta dependencia repitió 6 instalaciones en su conteo y una la ubicó de manera errónea en medio del mar. Posterior a esto, y al realizar nuestro propio registro, reconocimos 372 posibles granjas de cerdos que no fueron enumeradas en el dictamen, lo que da un total de 872 granjas en Yucatán, un número superior al reportado por el gobierno. Cabe destacar que algunas de las instalaciones no registradas por la Semarnat son megagranjas con más de 20 naves, muchas de las cuales se encuentran dentro o cerca de áreas naturales protegidas que han sido reconocidas como sitios Ramsar. Desafortunadamente, tal cantidad de granjas excede la capacidad de renovación del ecosistema. A pesar de este problema, las empresas siguen instalando en estas zonas nuevas megagranjas porcícolas e incluso instalaciones avícolas. El dictamen de la Semarnat concluyó que ya existen serias afectaciones en la calidad del agua, suelo y aire de la zona como resultado de las operaciones de las megagranjas porcícolas en Yucatán. Esta contaminación también está presente en los humedales protegidos por la Convención de Ramsar. Nuestro futuro está en riesgo. La selva maya no aguanta ni una granja más. Firma la petición para que la Semarnat solicite una misión Ramsar que nos ayude a frenar la expansión de las megagranjas en Yucatán.
Thank you, Phoebe. I know the video was in Spanish, but I'm going to give you more context in the next slides. So next slide, please, Phoebe. So I'm going to start by explaining a little bit about what is the SOS Yucatan campaign. It is a communication campaign whose name, by the word SOS, seeks to make an urgent call on the authorities to act immediately and on the public to raise awareness of the environmental destruction and the impact on the wetlands of the area. I don't know if you've ever, like some of you, been to Yucatan, but I'm pretty sure if you have, you've heard of the cenotes, which are like this incredible wetlands that look like crystal. So yeah, these wetlands are home to various species of flora and fauna, and the effects are caused by they are affected by the alarming number of megafarms in the Yucatan Peninsula. Next slide, please. So our strategy consists of 2 main tactics. The first one being a content tactic, which focuses on our main channels, which are Instagram and TikTok. And since we aim to reach young voices that will amplify the message, we've chosen TikTok to do that. We also want to reach out to the media in a traditional way, as we do it here in Mexico, which consists, if you know, of press bureau, press releasing, and calling them and talking to them about the campaign. So through a series of videos on our platforms, we meticulously lay the foundations of what factory pig farms are and what mega farms are. From a storytelling standpoint, this ensures that our audience understand very well the subject. So the campaign is divided into 2 stages. The first one started in March and will go all the way through June, and the second one will start in July and will go all the way through December. I'm going to talk to you about the background. So before we launched the SOS campaign, we launched 2 other campaigns in 2023. The first one was focused on what is the pig farm industry and what is the we focused it on animal cruelty. And the other one is called megatoxic farms. You can also look at it in our Instagram, which is MFA_Latino, and it mainly focuses on raising awareness about the existence of these mega farms. As you saw in the video, maybe you noticed some numbers there. So I'm going to talk to you about those in a little bit, but that is a very important thing about this mega toxic farms campaign, because we wanted to let the public know first what the mega farms were, to lay the foundations for to launch this year the SOS Yucatan in 2024. With the mega toxic farms campaign, we appeared on Millennium, which is one of the leading news channels in the country, and my colleague Sophie gave a great interview there. So our main objective of the campaign is to obtain neutral experts' results about the impact of industrial farms in Yucatan through a non-binding opinion based on the request for a RAM. As Erica said, a RAM is a Ramsar advisory mission. So if you're going to be hearing RAM, that's what I mean. So how are we going to do this? We're going to do this by pressuring the Mexican government. So it requests a RAM through the Semarnat, which is our Secretariat of Environment and Natural Resources, and the CONAMP, which is our National Commission of Natural Protected Areas. So this is going to be on the status of the protected wetlands of Yucatan by the Ramsar Convention, especially the one called Anillo de Cenotes, or Ring of Cenotes, which with our main goal being to verify the effects that the pig farms have caused to the Mayan rainforest. The Mayan rainforest is the primary ecosystem in Yucatan, as I was saying before, is home of various species of flora and fauna, and also of many communities in Yucatan. Our goals are following the main objectives. So the first one is to attract national and international attention, to put pressure on state and federal authorities to stop the installation and operation of industrial pig farms in Yucatan that operate outside the law, continue to build and operate with illegal environmental impact permits, allow the exploitation of thousands of animals in non-existent animal welfare conditions, perpetuate the violation of the human rights of indigenous communities, impact ecosystems and endemic species irreversibly, and moreover, represent a danger to accessing drinking water. So as you can see, the farms not only impact the wetlands, but they also have an impact on the community, because it puts their health at risk, and it also takes their territories, because the 86% of the farms are built in their territories. So secondly, we also want to raise awareness among the population about two main messages. The first one being the contamination of soil, air, and water, and the second one being the exploitation of millions of animals. The state of Yucatan occupies the third place in pig population with 1.6 million pigs, and also the third place in the population of hens and chickens with 38 million. In March 2023, and this is what I was talking about before, Semarnat presented a report on pig farming activity in Yucatan, which counted 507 possibly pig farms and their impact on the wetlands. However, Mercy for Animals did their own investigation following their same methodology, and we found 372 additional possible pig farms that were not listed in the previous report. So this results in 872 farms in Yucatan. In the video that I showed you before, there's a map where we show that the Semarnat counted the same farm 6 times, and they also placed a farm in the middle of the sea. So yeah, this was not very accurate. Then the evidence shows that these farms house up to 100,000 pigs, which turns them into mega farms. This means they are not just prominent in scale, but also have a significant environmental impact. Their production primarily is exported to other countries, but the results affect Yucatan by millions of liters being dumped in enormous open air pits. So we will measure our success by obtaining the opinion of experts through a Ramsar advisory mission, or a RAM, about the impact of the factory pig farms in Yucatan, and from the signatures collected in our petition on change.org, which will support Semarnat in requesting this mission. So what progress have we made so far? Now I'm going to talk to you about some KPIs, and I'm not going to like talk to you about each one of them because I know we don't have much time. But till now, we have posted 16 posts on both our channels, which are Instagram and TikTok, and as I was saying, and we have a total reach of unique users of more than 700,000 and a total impressions of 800,000, more than that. We had more than 400,000 views of our videos and more than 6,000 likes, and we've reached a great number of comments, which might not look like a lot to you, but when it comes to animal welfare, this is a lot to us. So we have 313 quality comments, which are creating this great conversation in our social media channels. About engagement, we have a 100% organic and a 15% paid. Our top post in March was the one that explained what was the RAM. Our top post in April was the one about the participation of our colleague Sophie in the Senate, where she went to talk in a forum about creating a better world for animals. This one was very successful, and our top post number 3 in May was one video where we show a little model of what happens in the wetlands. So if you want to see it, you can visit our Instagram. Next slide, please. Media hits. So we have, I only chose the top hits to show here. So we have the first one on Aristegui Noticias, which is a highly positioned online news platform owned by Mexican journalist and anchor woman, Carmen Aristegui. She is recognized by her critical investigations of the Mexican government. Then we have 2 articles on Por Esto, which is the leading newspaper in the state of Yucatan in its online version. And we also have 1 article in Sol Yucatan, which is also a local newspaper from Yucatan. Also, after we launched the campaign, 2 weeks after, Semarnat's head of International Affairs Coordinating Unit contacted us to request a meeting. And after that meeting, they agreed to our investigation and to correct the number of pig farms that they had presented in their previous report. Signatures. We've reached 66% of the signatures that we need to collect in order to take to Semarnat. Now, this slide is very important because it talks about collaboration across movements. And I want to say, like, other organizations have played a big role in this campaign too. And we want to thank them because they're part of these achievements. So we've collaborated in social content with GEMV, Observatorio Animal, and Comunidad Vegana, and they helped us to amplify the message. Next slide, please. And our NGO partners, when it comes to on the policy side, are Anima Naturalis, Biofutura, Conexión Animal Mérida, Fundación VEG, Canal Derechos Humanos, and Youth Building the Future Global. We are very grateful for their response and their support. So the next steps are, first of all, to collect signatures with the help of the Mayan communities. Second, bring the total number of signatures to the Semarnat and the CONAMP to request a Ramsar mission be carried out in Yucatan, and therefore to contact the media about this and continue to put pressure. How can the audience members support the campaign? Well, you can sign the change.org petition, tag the authorities in Mexico, which you can see in our Instagram post, and share our videos to ask the Semarnat to request a RAM. Our future is at risk, and the Mayan rainforest cannot stand one more farm. So the lessons learned, last but not least, are what guidance or lessons learned can this provide to advocates interested in pursuing similar Ramsar campaigns in other countries, where the first one would be where a protected site is being degraded by animal farming operations. The Ramsar Convention may be able to support obtaining expert scientific and technical advice. And the second one is that the findings of a RAM could be a powerful and persuasive tool, as Erica was saying, to prompt government action to address the damage that megafarms projects inflict on wetland ecosystems and the environment. And that is all from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carmen and Erica. And for audience members, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box. We have a few minutes left to answer questions and have a little bit of discussion. And then if you have any questions after the webinar, please feel free to reach out to any of us by email, and our emails are here on the screen. And Carmen, as we're getting started with questions, I wonder if you would like to put the link to the petition in the chat so that the audience can also do that in the last few minutes as well.
Sure, I'll do that.
Thank you. Okay, so as people are thinking of questions, there was one question that came in advance by email, and that was how the Ramsar Convention could address impacts from aquaculture. So Erica, I wondered if you might want to take that one.
Sure. I mean, I think that anywhere here in this presentation where we've talked about animal agriculture, you could sub in aquaculture, in that to the extent that aquaculture is affecting negatively the ecological character of a site based on that timeline of when that site was listed, it's something that should be flagged to the Secretariat and to the host government if they happen to be unaware of it. And of course, when that happens, that's when the potential for these facilitative mechanisms to be triggered exists. And I think that what I really like so much about Carmen's presentation, which is like real life on the ground work coupled with the presentation about the Ramsar Convention and how it works, is you can sort of see how you might imagine building advocacy around this international opportunity to motivate local governments, regional government, national governments to take action to address problems, and either then encourage that national government to request a Ramsar advisory mission and or write a letter yourself to the Secretariat. Oh my gosh, excuse me, I'm sorry. Write a letter to the Secretariat to highlight concerns about particular changes in ecological character and suggest that a Ramsar advisory mission might be a good outcome. The benefit of the latter, and of course both can happen in parallel, but as an advocate in the latter situation, when you're writing the letter, obviously you control the narrative, right? And so the information that's shared with the Secretariat, like, so for example, if the government of Mexico hadn't agreed to change its report or accept Mercy for Animals data, it might have been really critical to put that information in front of the Secretariat as it's evaluating whether a Ramsar mission is, a potential option for this particular wetland. And then at the same time, you can also suggest what are the stakeholders that the experts should meet with, what kind of information should the expert team collect, et cetera. So those are, that's sort of, I got a little down a path, but hopefully that answers the basic question.
Thank you. Yes, I think that does. And one more question for you, Erica. You had mentioned that a country has to be responsive to a RAM and that campaigns can help in this regard. Could you share a little bit more about what that responsibility of the country is?
Yeah, and I actually invite Carmen to, jump in here as well in terms of what they're thinking and working on in the Yucatan. But the idea is that this Article 3.2 case opens, it doesn't close until the problem is resolved. And although that case sort of exists in the international environmental ether, it is something that the government, because it has these obligations under a particular treaty, is supposed to respond to. Of course, there are situations where governments don't respond, right? And there's like recalcitrance in terms of sharing information and addressing problems. That said, I do think it's fair to say that the response rate and the depth of the potential dialogue between the country, any kind of experts that are brought in, and the Secretariat is more likely strong than not, right? And so because this idea of like there being a shaming element to international processes or concerns raised, I think is really true. And Mexico in particular, it's honestly a great example of a country. It hosts the most Ramsar wetlands of any other country. So it's responsive to its Ramsar obligations. It's demonstrated interest in protecting wetlands in the past. And wetlands are they're functionally so important to ecosystems and to human well-being as well as to biodiversity that I think there's interest in resolving problems. And then maybe this is where Carmen can jump in, but engaging in a campaign that calls attention to challenges of an internationally protected site and maybe recalcitrance or lack of enforcement or whatever the issues are that are causing those problems, like that public interest is accountability, right? And if the Secretariat is saying, hey, we have eyes on this situation, it's an additional layer of accountability. And I think it just kind of creates a sort of a situation in which a particular government likely has to show or would want to show some kind of steps in the right direction.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, Erica, thank you, that you're right. Like, that's why we have two objectives. One is to attract the attention of the authorities, and the second one is to also raise public awareness, because this will help us to put pressure on the government to respond, right? So we have these two pillars of communications right now, and as I was saying, we might not have like millions of comments, but like the comments that we've received from the audience are very positive. So we are hopeful that this will help us to put more pressure on Semarnat, CONAMP, and like the government to request the mission. And we are very hopeful that the mission is this very powerful tool that will help us save the wetlands. But yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Thank you so much. And I'm sorry to say, I think we're out of time. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And please do follow up with us by email, and we'll be sharing the recording of this. And we hope you take a look at the report itself. So thank you so much everyone for joining, and have a wonderful day.